Hi everybody. I want to start by thanking the organizers for putting together this conference and inviting me to speak. In this presentation, I would like to give a brief sketch of the main argument of my paper. As the title suggests, the main claim of the paper concerns how to categorize recent Bayesian accounts of perception. To start, it is useful to look at two traditions in psychological and philosophical theories of perception. Both traditions attempt to explain why we see the world as we do. These two traditions are ecology and inferentialism. The main difference between them is that according to inferentialism, vision involves a construction or an unconscious inference. Ecology denies the need for this inference. Ecologists claim that we are simply attuned to the environment. Current Bayesian accounts of perception are typically categorized as belonging to the inferential tradition. By contrast, I will argue that we should rethink of Bayesianism as belonging to the ecological camp. This is true for two reasons. One is that Bayesian accounts need to be grounded in natural scene statistics in order to explain how the inverse problem of perception is solved. The second reason is that Bayesian accounts introduce processes that are not truly inferential. Safe for perceptual hypotheses, Bayesian models introduce structures that are not properly seen as representations. The idea that vision involves an unconscious inference is often introduced by reference to the inverse problem. The problem is that the same retinal projection is compatible with many distal causes, but we see just one. So we need to explain how we derive a single percept from underdetermined data. Consider this image. The round elements in this image are typically seen as convex and illuminated from above, but they can also be seen as concave and illuminated from below. Some of you may be able to see the elements that way. If you're not, it helps to rotate the figure. So here we have the same visual input that can be seen in more than one way. Why do we typically see the elements as convex? In inferential frameworks, the idea is that the visual system uses some implicit knowledge concerning what is more likely present in the environment. Bayesian accounts, in particular, claim that the visual system forms hypotheses concerning what is more likely out there. These hypotheses are ranked based on prior knowledge. So, for example, in this image, these two hypotheses are the relevant ones, and the visual system uses some prior knowledge to determine which one is more plausible. The implicit knowledge is made up of priors and hyperpriors. An example of a hyperprior is that light comes from above. An example of a prior is that objects are typically convex. The difference between these two is mainly a difference in generality. Hyperpriors are more general. So given this implicit knowledge, the hypothesis that the elements are convex and illuminated from above is more plausible. Since the incoming sensory stimulation is compatible with this hypothesis, hypothesis S is confirmed. Here is a simplified model of the whole process. The same sensory stimulus on the left is compatible with two hypotheses, S and C. But because of prior assumptions concerning light coming from above and convexity, S is initially more likely to be true. So it is the hypothesis that needs to be checked against the evidence. A plausible way to understand how this is done is to suppose that the hypothesis generates mock sensory input, that is, the kind of stimulus that would have to be present if the hypothesis were true. The mock sensation is checked against the actual sensation for error. If there is no error, the likelihood of the hypothesis is high and the hypothesis is confirmed. As a result, we see convex elements illuminated from above. Notice that in this story, the prior knowledge plays a big role in selecting what we see. This is because the sensory stimulation is compatible with both hypotheses. So it is primarily because of the priors that hypothesis S wins. This is why proponents of Bayesian accounts of perception often remark that expectations drive what we see. Now, despite the apparent plausibility of this account, there is a recognized problem. The problem is that we have no story of how the hypothesis space is restricted. The hypothesis space is the set of initial hypotheses over which priors operate. In this example, the set includes two hypotheses S and C, and the priors assign higher probability to S. But given genuinely underdetermined data, this hypothesis space is infinite, and we do not know how to restrict it. How does the visual system know that the incoming stimulus is given either by something convex or by something concave and nothing else? This is a pressing question because it is a question about how to reduce uncertainty. It is a question of the same kind as the inverse problem question. So if we do not answer it, it seems that we also fail to answer the inverse problem. Now, the problem for Bayesians is that priors and hyperpriors do not do the required work. Hyperpriors are too general to restrict the space to hypotheses about particular objects. Additionally, both priors and hyperpriors need to be activated. There are many different priors and hyperpriors. Some concern faces, some concern horizontal structure, some concern edges. Presumably, there are as many priors as the objects and properties that we can see. A prior about faces would not be of much help in interpreting the figure with the convex dots. The brain has to be told that it is the prior about convexity that should be in play in processing this image. But it seems that Bayesian accounts do not have a story of how this happens unless they appeal to the incoming sensory signal. The incoming signal plausibly restricts the hypothesis space. It tells the brain that what is present is either convex or concave. But this means that the signal is not as underdetermined as we first thought. It reduces uncertainty from infinity to a manageable number of hypotheses. And now, if the signal can do that, then why not think that it reduces uncertainty altogether? Priors and hyperpriors are not needed at all. The signal tells the brain that what is present is likely convex. Expectations do not drive perception, the driving sensation does. Accepting this point would mean accepting that the stimulus for vision is not underdetermined in practice. It is underdetermined only in principle. In our specific environment, it has typical causes. The moral of the previous slide is that Bayesian accounts of perception should be grounded in a study of the statistical regularities that occur in our world. This is what ecological approaches propose. This study is already carried out in a research program called Natural Scene Statistics. Through the analysis of a large number of images of natural scenes, researchers in this paradigm study both what is very common in our environment and what kind of retinal projections different elements cause. So the inverse problem is solved by studying what actually corresponds to different retinal stimulations. Proponents of this approach study the statistical regularities that priors are supposed to mirror. By doing so, they make appeal to the priors themselves superfluous. In our example, the image is seen in terms of convex dots because the image projects on the retina stimulus that in our world is typically caused by convex elements illuminated from above. The written version of my paper provides a more detailed description of natural scene statistics. We're then done with the first of my claims. Bayesian models of perception need to be grounded in an ecological approach in order to explain how uncertainty is reduced. Now, you may think that even though this is true, the processes that Bayesians talk about are useful descriptions of what happens in the brain. Quite apart from the inverse problem, Bayesian models describe how the brain attunes to the statistical regularities of the world in which it is situated. Since I agree with this, the next step is to show that Bayesian inferences are not genuine inferences. To run this argument, we need to understand the notion of unconscious inference. A plausible way to understand this notion is to suppose that an inference is a process that uses mental representations, in particular representations of two kinds, sensory representations and represented assumptions. Now, why do we need the represented assumptions? This is because we want to distinguish mental inferences from other kinds of mental transitions, like associations. In associations, representations follow one another simply because of frequent co-occurrence. Bayesian models presume that encoded prior assumptions affect what we see, and that sensory states are used to check on the currently winning hypothesis. Typically, these are both taken to be representational elements of Bayesian perceptual systems. To confirm that this is a plausible way to understand visual inferences, here is a small number of passages from proponents of inferentialism. I will not read the passages for lack of time, but they can be found both here and in the paper. These passages concern sensory representations, and these passages concern represented assumptions. Because the notion of representation is central to the notion of unconscious mental inference, we need some grasp of what mental representations are. Since my audience is likely to know a lot about representation, I will not go through each of the platitudes on this slide. I would like to pay attention mainly to 5 and 6. Reflection on the notion of representation used to be centered on content and on giving naturalistically acceptable conditions for misrepresentation. More recently, the attention has shifted to give non-trivializing conditions for representation. The worry is that we should not confuse representations, which are distinctive psychological notions, with mere causal mediators or mere detectors. Ecologists and eliminativists of other kinds do not deny that there are detectors and causal mediators in the brain. They rather deny that we need to introduce representations in order to explain mental activity. Platitudes 5 and 6 are presumed to be very important to draw the distinction between representation and detection. 6 has it that representations have to be somewhat independent from what they stand for. Representations are introduced when a system's performance is not controlled by the world, but by an internal model of the world. So there has to be some sort of independence between representations and what they're about. If there isn't, the performance can be explained simply by appeal to the world and perhaps to some causal intermediaries. There are different ways of spelling out this notion of independence or detachability. Some use the idea of offline use. Some do it in terms of content. Since the basic insight is that representations are needed when the performance of a system is not controlled by the environment, one way to understand this independence is that representations are about what is absent. They help us coordinate with what is not present to the senses. My proposal is then to understand sensory representations as detectors. Detectors are states that track proximal conditions and that cause other things to happen, typically in a restricted domain. The states of your skin that respond to damage, for example, and that initiate coagulation are detectors. When a system uses detectors, what the system does can be mostly explained in terms of what happens in the environment, and also perhaps in terms of what happens at the physiological level. When a system uses representations, this is not the case. If you're at home and you use a map to plan your next vacation, you do something that is explainable by appeal to the map, not by appeal to the immediate circumstances you're in minus the map. The proposal is also to understand encoded assumptions and implicit knowledge as mere biases. This is in fact a proposal that proponents of predictive coding views sometimes entertain. A bias is a functional feature of a system that makes the system act lawfully. It is a feature that skews the system towards certain transitions or certain configurations. An association is an example of a bias. Being biased means developing under ongoing and evolutionary pressure features that make a system act in a regimented way. A bias can skew the visual system, for example, to always move from certain retinal projections to perceptions of convex objects. We can suppose that sensory states are detectors and that priors, hyperpriors, and likelihoods are biases. In this picture, Bayesian processes are not genuinely inferential. They do not use representations. The products of perceptual processing may be representations, as they can stand for something convex when there is nothing convex, but the stages of such processing are not themselves representations. What are some of the reasons that make me suppose that priors, hyperpriors, and likelihoods are better seen as biases rather than as encoded pieces of knowledge? First, in Bayesian accounts, priors, hyperpriors, and likelihoods do not look like premises. They do not enter into semantic transitions with sensory states. They rather look like valves that skew brains towards certain hypotheses. Second, encoded assumptions are sometimes stored and used in a variety of contexts, but priors are proprietary to the perceptual system. The conscious perceiver doesn't know about them. The hyperprior concerning light coming from above, for example, is really that light comes from above and slightly to the left. We do not know why this is the case, and we do not typically know about this prior. Third, biased processes are stubborn to contrary evidence, and vision is famously insensitive to contrary information. In the famous Müller-Lyer illusion on the left, you continue to see the lines as different in length even after you know that they're not. There are other examples of this stubbornness. Consider the figures on the right from Canizza. Given contextual information, the occluded figure should be seen as an octagon. Perceivers, however, do not report seeing it as an octagon, but as an irregular figure. Next, what are some of the reasons that make me suppose that sensory states are mere detectors? In Bayesian accounts, there is a certain ambiguity concerning sensory states. Many Bayesians remark that sensation is primarily in the business of signaling error, so we have to think of sensory states as having multiple functions. But even if we consider them under different guises, it seems that they do not guide action and are not properly detached from proximal conditions to count as representations. Indeed, error signals and mock sensations are not even for guiding action. They perform a narcissistic function. They are concerned with the brain's error-free equilibrium. If this is true, then Bayesian perceptual processes are better seen as biased processes that operate over detectors. They are not inferences. They are ecologically acceptable processes. So, I first argue that Bayesian perceptual models have to be grounded in natural scene statistics. I also argue that Bayesian models introduce processes that are ecologically friendly. The models explain how the brain attunes to the environment in a way that an ecologist can be happy with. I conclude that Bayesian perception is ecological perception. Thank you.